63 years living a lie. That sentence hammered in my head as I stared at the stack of Watchtower magazines piled up in the basement of my house in Manchester, England. 42 years of dedicated service, thousands of hours door-to-door in rain and sun, countless meetings where I nodded my head in automatic agreement, and now, sitting in that damp, moldy-smelling basement, I finally saw the truth that had been right in front of my eyes the whole time. My hands trembled holding a 1975 Watchtower, the one that promised the end of the world, the Armageddon that never came. Beside it, one from 1914, then 1925, and so many other dates that dissolved into the air like cigarette smoke. How could I have been so blind? The question echoed in every fiber of my being. I had sacrificed relationships, career opportunities, the chance to truly know my grandchildren, all in the name of an organization that proclaimed itself God's spokesman on earth. The governing body, those 8 men in New York who controlled every aspect of our lives, from what we could read to whom we could speak, now seemed exactly what they always were, ordinary, fallible men, hungry for control. The last straw was discovering the policies on child abuse, the failed prophecies systematically swept under the rug, the constant doctrinal changes disguised as new light. I had dedicated my entire life to spreading a message that changed according to the organization's convenience. On that cold November night, at 63 years old, I made the most terrifying and liberating decision of my life. I was leaving. I was going to abandon everything I had known for 4 decades. And for the first time in all those years, I felt something I had forgotten existed, true freedom. This is the story of how I woke up. Before I start telling you my complete journey, I need you to understand one thing: leaving Jehovah's Witnesses is not like switching churches or deciding to stop attending a social club. It's losing your entire family structure at once, it's having friends of decades treat you as if you are dead, it's waking up one day and realizing that everything you believed, every major decision you made, every sacrifice you offered, was based on doctrines created by men who claimed to be inspired by God but who changed their minds with the blowing wind. It is devastating and liberating at the same time, and I promise to share every painful detail and every moment of clarity I had in this process. My real name doesn't matter now, but you can call me Thomas, the name I chose for this new life. I was born in 1962 into a family already involved with the Witnesses, but it wasn't until I was 21 that I was truly baptized. I grew up in Manchester, at a time when the organization was growing rapidly in England, and I saw firsthand how the doctrines molded entire families, how they created a bubble impermeable to the outside world. Throughout all those years, I served as an elder, was a regular pioneer, helped build kingdom halls, attended regional and district assemblies. I was what they call a pillar of the congregation, that brother everyone trusted, who knew the doctrines by heart, who could refute any apostate argument without blinking. But something changed when I turned 60. Perhaps it's the proximity to death that makes us question everything. Perhaps it's the accumulation of small doubts that have been piling up over the years like snow on a roof about to collapse. The truth is, I started to see cracks in the organization's perfect facade, and once you start seeing, you can no longer stop seeing. Before we dive into this life-changing story, do one thing for me: subscribe to this channel, leave your like so that more people can find this account, and, most importantly, leave a comment saying which city you are watching this video from. I want to know where the people are who, like me, are seeking the real truth, not the truth packaged and sold by religious organizations. Your interaction helps this content reach those who truly need to hear this story. And believe me, many people need to wake up just as I did. Now, let me tell you how everything started to crumble. The year was 2022, and I was preparing a talk for the midweek meeting on biblical chronology, one of my favorite topics because I genuinely believed we had the absolute truth about time prophecies. I was studying the book of Daniel, specifically the 70-year prophecy, when something just didn't click. It wasn't the first time I'd had this feeling, but I had always pushed these doubts to the back of my mind, labeling them as lack of faith or the influence of Satan trying to lead me astray. But that night, alone in my office with piles of old publications spread across the table, the crack turned into an unignorable fissure. The organization has always taught that Jerusalem was destroyed in 607 BCE by the Babylonians, a crucial date for calculating 1914 as the start of Christ's invisible presence and the beginning of the last days. This doctrine was the foundation of everything, the basis that sustained our identity as God's chosen people in these final times. But as I reviewed the references, I realized that all historians, archaeologists, and even the Babylonian cuneiform tablets themselves pointed to 587 or 586 BCE as the actual date of Jerusalem's destruction. A difference of 20 years seems small, but it completely demolished the 1914 chronology, and consequently, all the authority the governing body claimed to have been established in that year. I tried to rationalize, as I had done so many times before. The organization had its reasons, surely there was something I was missing, some information that would explain this discrepancy. I started searching in old publications, the ones that were no longer available on the official website because they had been quietly removed. That's when I discovered something that chilled me. The organization had always known that 607 was not historically sustainable. There were veiled acknowledgments in publications from the 1970s and 1980s that the date was problematic, but instead of correcting the error, they simply continued to promote the false date because admitting the error would mean admitting that the entire doctrinal structure was built on quicksand. I spent sleepless nights, my wife asking what was bothering me. She had been a Jehovah's Witness longer than I had, her entire family had been in the organization for 3 generations. How could I share these doubts with her without destroying our marriage? In the organization, doubting is equivalent to apostasy, and apostasy means being disfellowshipped, which results in losing contact with everyone you love. It's a perfect system of mind control. Create bonds so strong with the community that the mere idea of losing those bonds paralyzes any critical thinking. And it worked perfectly, until it worked too well and started to suffocate you. I started paying closer attention at the meetings, listening with different ears. I noticed how the talks were extremely controlled, always returning to the same points: obey the governing body, do not trust independent thinking, avoid any external source of information, keep busy with theocratic activities so as not to have time to question. It was pure conditioning, and I had been both the conditioned and the conditioner for decades. How many people had I helped enter this mental prison? How many Bible students had I convinced that this was the only true religion, using the same flawed arguments that now made me feel nauseous? The failed prophecies began to haunt me. I remembered 1975, when I was 13 and the adults around me sold their houses, quit their jobs, convinced that Armageddon would arrive that year. I remembered the collective disappointment when nothing happened, and how the organization simply blamed the members for reading too much into the publications, as if they themselves hadn't created all that expectation. And it wasn't just 1975. There was 1914, 1918, 1925, each date passing without fulfillment, each failure being rewritten in the organization's official history as if it had never happened. I retrieved an old 1968 watchtower I found in the basement, where it explicitly stated that young people should not waste time on higher education because the end would come before they completed their studies. How many talented young people threw away life opportunities because of that guidance? And now, decades later, the organization subtly changed the discourse, saying that education is a personal decision, while still strongly discouraging any academic pursuit. They didn't apologize, they didn't acknowledge the damage caused, they simply moved on as if nothing had happened. The weight of this discovery was overwhelming. I sat on the edge of the bed in the early hours, looking at my wife sleeping peacefully, and thought about all the choices we made based on the organization's guidance. We didn't have children because we thought it would be selfish to bring children into this world so close to the end. I turned down an excellent promotion at work years ago because it would demand more hours and less time for field service. I cut off contact with my younger brother when he was disfellowshipped at 22, over 40 years ago, and he died 5 years ago without me having the chance to reconcile with him. All those decisions, all those irreparable losses, based on doctrines I now discovered were fallible human constructs disguised as divine truth. But still, I was afraid to investigate further. Fear is a powerful tool, and the organization knew very well how to use it. They taught us that questioning was opening the door to Satan, that researching external sources was contaminating our minds with apostasy, that even talking to former members was enough to destroy us spiritually. It was a hermetic bubble, designed to keep people in, not by genuine conviction, but by psychological terror of what would happen if they left. And I had been inside that bubble for so long that I no longer realized I was breathing rarefied air. The definitive break in my blind faith in the organization came when I started researching the governing body itself, those 8 men who lived in the Warwick, New York complex and made all the decisions affecting millions of Jehovah's Witnesses around the world. Throughout my life as a witness, I saw them as modern apostles, anointed men chosen directly by Jehovah to guide his people in these last days. Questioning them was equivalent to questioning God himself. But when I started to truly investigate who these people were, their history, their credentials, their past decisions, the carefully cultivated image began to disintegrate. I discovered that none of them had formal theological training, academic biblical education, or any kind of specialized preparation that justified their absolute authority over doctrinal interpretations. They were, for the most part, men who simply rose through the organizational hierarchy over the years, demonstrating unquestioning loyalty to existing doctrines. Their only real qualification was being anointed, that is, claiming to have the heavenly hope instead of the earthly one, something completely subjective and impossible to verify. Anyone could claim to be anointed, and in fact, the number of anointed ones, which should have been decreasing as the end approached, was inexplicably increasing every year, yet another doctrinal inconsistency conveniently ignored. I began to study the doctrinal changes over the decades, tracking how the governing body changed its position on crucial topics repeatedly. The issue of blood transfusions is perhaps the most tragic example, initially permitted, then completely prohibited in the 1940s, then with exceptions for certain blood fractions, then more exceptions, then more changes, each alteration presented as new light from Jehovah when it was clearly just men changing their minds. How many people died refusing treatments that would now be allowed? How many parents watched their children die because of a policy that would later be modified? And where was the accountability for these unnecessary deaths? I read about child abuse cases within the congregations, something the organization vehemently denied existed in its public publications, but which legal documents revealed to be a systemic problem. The two-witness rule, derived from a literal interpretation of biblical texts about accusations, was applied even in cases of child sexual abuse, which meant that unless there were 2 witnesses to the abuse, the accused would not be punished by the congregation, and often the victim was advised not to go to the police because it would bring reproach on Jehovah's name. The organization's legal departments maintained secret databases with thousands of known abusers but did not report these cases to the authorities, hiding behind religious confidentiality laws. I watched leaked videos of the governing body's annual meetings, where they openly discussed public relations strategies, financial concerns, and how to deal with lawsuits. There was nothing spiritual in those discussions, it was pure corporatism, businessmen managing a multi-billion-dollar organization disguised as a religion. I found out about the valuable real estate properties the organization owned, the financial investments, the multi-million-dollar out-of-court settlements paid to abuse victims to avoid negative publicity. All this while constantly asking for more donations from members, many of whom were barely able to pay their own bills, being encouraged to leave the organization as the beneficiary in wills and life insurance policies. The case of the Australian Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse was particularly revealing. Jeffrey Jackson, a member of the governing body, was called to testify and, under oath, admitted that it would be presumptuous to claim they were God's only spokesman on earth. This admission, made in a secular court to avoid accusations of religious arrogance, completely contradicted everything that was taught to members. In the congregations, we were taught that questioning the governing body was questioning Jehovah himself, but when legally confronted, one of their most prominent members admitted that maybe they weren't so special after all. The hypocrisy was shocking. I spent time reviewing old publications on the generation teaching, a central doctrine about when the end would come. The organization had changed the understanding of generation at least 5 times since 1914, each time stretching the definition to accommodate the fact that the promised end kept not arriving. First, it was the generation that saw 1914, then it was an extended generation, then it was 2 overlapping generations, reaching the current absurd concept of overlapping generations, which essentially allowed the deadline to be extended indefinitely. It was pure manipulation, moving the goalposts every time the ball was about to pass. I discovered that many of the books we studied were written by anonymous committees, not by the governing body members themselves, and that much of the material was simply copied and repackaged from old publications without proper critical review. The famous deep research, they claimed to do was often just citations of their own previous publications, creating a circular reference where they cited themselves as the authority. When they cited external sources, they often did so selectively, taking quotes out of context or even distorting what the original authors had said to support their predetermined positions. I remembered all the times I repeated to Bible students that this was the only organization on earth guided by the Holy Spirit, the only one that had the pure and unaltered truth. How could I have been so blind? The evidence of manipulation, control, and human fallibility was everywhere, but the conditioning was so strong that my brain simply filtered out everything that didn't fit the official narrative. Now, with my eyes open, I saw clearly that the governing body was no different from the leaders of any other authoritarian religious organization, fallible men claiming divine authority to maintain control over their followers. The question that kept me awake was, if they were wrong about so many things, if they constantly changed their positions, if they covered up abuse and manipulated information, what else were they hiding? And more importantly, how could I continue to promote this organization knowing what I now knew? My conscience would no longer allow me to live this lie. The more I discovered, the more I realized that the organization's true power was not in its doctrines, but in its sophisticated system of social control that kept members trapped through the fear of losing everything they knew and loved. The policy of disfellowshipping and shunning was the most powerful weapon in their arsenal, a tool that turned families into enforcers of organizational punishment, forcing parents to cut off contact with children, siblings to become strangers, friends of decades to treat each other as dead. And all this was presented as love, as protection of the congregation from corrupting influences, when it was in reality a cruel mechanism of coercion and control. During my years as an elder, I participated in countless judicial committees, sessions where 3 elders met with a member accused of some sin to determine if the person was genuinely repentant or should be disfellowshipped. Now, looking back with clarity, I saw how those processes were deeply flawed and dehumanizing. 3 men without any training in psychology, counseling, or even basic law, determined a person's social and familial fate based on subjective criteria and often influenced by personal prejudices. The questions asked to young women about intimate details of sexual transgressions were invasive and traumatizing, going far beyond what was necessary to establish repentance. I remembered specific cases that now filled me with shame. A young single mother who was disfellowshipped for accepting a job that required working a few hours in a bar, considered a spiritually dangerous environment by the organization, even though it was the only way to support her child. Her parents, still active members, were instructed to cut off contact with her, and they obeyed, leaving her completely alone at a crucial moment in her life. A 19-year-old young man disfellowshipped for confessing homosexuality, instantly losing his entire family and support network, leading him to a suicide attempt that was almost successful. How many lives destroyed by inhumane policies disguised as spiritual purity? I discovered that former members who simply left quietly, without making a fuss or criticizing the organization, were still treated as apostates if they expressed any doubt or disagreement, even in private conversations. The organization had created a category called bad association that allowed them to treat even those who had not been formally disfellowshipped as if they had been, all based on unwritten rules and interpretations of local elders. The arbitrary power given to these men was frightening, and I had been one of them, wielding that power without question, sincerely believing I was protecting Jehovah's flock. The stories of destroyed families multiplied as I researched. Elderly parents dying alone because their adult children had been disfellowshipped decades ago for questioning doctrines, marriages broken because one spouse started questioning and the other chose the organization, grandparents who never met their grandchildren because the shunning policy extended through generations. And all this was reinforced in talks and Watchtower articles that repeatedly reminded members that maintaining shunning was a demonstration of loyalty to Jehovah, that speaking to disfellowshipped ones, even if they were their own children, was disobedience that could cost them their own salvation. I realized I had witnessed and participated in systematic institutional gaslighting. When people raised legitimate concerns about doctrines or policies, they were immediately labeled as spiritually weak, influenced by Satan, too proud to accept theocratic guidance. The problem was never the organization, it was always the questioning person. If you were unhappy, it was because you weren't doing enough in field service. If you had doubts, it was because you were allowing independent thinking instead of trusting the governing body. If you were struggling financially after following the organization's advice to avoid higher education and work less for pioneering, it was because you didn't have enough faith that Jehovah would provide. The social pressure for conformity was intense and constant. Every aspect of life was monitored and judged: what clothes you wore, what entertainment you consumed, whom you spent time with, how much time you dedicated to theocratic activities, even your facial expressions during meetings. Elders made shepherding calls that were essentially interrogation sessions disguised as spiritual concern. Members were encouraged to report on each other if they saw questionable behavior. It was an atmosphere of mutual surveillance that created paranoia and made genuine authenticity impossible. I saw how the organization systematically controlled information. Official websites blocked or removed problematic content. Old publications containing embarrassingly failed prophecies were discontinued and discouraged from being kept. Quotes from external authorities were carefully selected to show only what supported predetermined positions. Members were explicitly instructed not to research the organization from external sources, not to read critical books written by former members, not to watch documentaries or news programs discussing controversies. Any negative information was automatically apostate lies, without even being examined. It was a perfect system of information control worthy of the most efficient totalitarian regimes in history. But perhaps the most insidious aspect was how the organization stole the individual sense of identity from members. You were no longer a person with your own thoughts, feelings, and desires. You were a Jehovah's Witness first and everything else second. Your personal dreams were replaced by organizational goals. Your family relationships were secondary to loyalty to the congregation. Even your parental instincts were overridden by the organization's policies when it came to child discipline or education. You became an extension of the organizational machine, and when you finally decided to leave, you discovered you no longer knew who you were without the identity the organization had built for you. Sitting there in my office, surrounded by evidence of decades of systematic manipulation, I felt an overwhelming mix of anger and sadness. Anger at having been so completely deceived, at having dedicated my entire life to something fundamentally dishonest. Sadness for the countless damaged lives, including my own, by this system of control disguised as true religion. And paralyzing fear of what it would mean to leave it all behind at 63 years old. The decision to leave the organization didn't come in a dramatic moment of sudden revelation, but like the slow dawn after an endless night, when you realize that the darkness is gradually giving way to the light and there's no turning back. It was a painful process of deconstruction, where every belief that had sustained my life for decades had to be examined, questioned, and often discarded as false or manipulated. It was like discovering that the foundation of your house was rotten and that collapse was inevitable, no matter how much you wished it weren't true. The final catalyst was an incident involving my niece, the daughter of a cousin who had drifted away from the organization years ago. She was 16 and had been secretly coming to me, asking questions about doctrines, clearly struggling with doubts as her parents pressured her to get baptized before she turned 18. I saw in her the same internal conflict I now recognized in myself, the tension between what her heart felt and what they told her she should believe. When she asked me directly if I really believed that Jehovah would destroy billions of good people at Armageddon just because they weren't Jehovah's Witnesses, including her own mother who had left the organization, I couldn't lie anymore. I looked into that young woman's eyes and saw innocence being destroyed by the toxic doctrine I had spent decades promoting. For the first time in my life as a witness, I spoke my real truth without organizational filters. No, I no longer believed that a God of love would destroy good people just for not belonging to the right organization. I no longer believed that small children would be massacred at Armageddon because their parents chose a different religion. I no longer believed that we had all the answers while the other 7 billion people on the planet were completely deceived. And the moment I spoke those words aloud, I knew I had crossed a line from which there was no return. My niece started crying, not from sadness but from relief, saying she had thought she was going crazy for having those same doubts. I advised her not to get baptized under pressure, to give herself time to grow and explore the world before committing to something so definitive. I knew that if anyone discovered this conversation, would be disfellowshipped immediately for apostasy, but something inside me had broken definitively, and I couldn't pretend anymore. For the first time in decades, I felt genuinely aligned with my conscience. I started making discrete changes in my life. I gradually reduced my participation in congregation activities, claiming health problems that weren't entirely false, as the stress of living this double life was physically affecting my body. I stopped accepting talk assignments, politely refused when asked to serve on judicial committees, and started missing meetings more often. My wife noticed the change and became increasingly worried, repeatedly asking what was wrong with me, if I was spiritually sick, if I needed help from the elders. How could I explain that I was sick precisely because I was finally seeing the truth? The pressure within the marriage intensified to the breaking point. One particularly difficult night, after another meeting where I sat in silence fighting nausea while listening to organizational propaganda disguised as Bible teaching, my wife demanded to know what was wrong. And then, violating all the rules of caution I had set for myself, I told her everything. I showed her the evidence about 607 versus 587, about the failed prophecies, about the child abuse policies, about the constant doctrinal changes. I stayed awake all night presenting decades of research I had accumulated, desperate for her to see what I was seeing. Her reaction was exactly what the organization had trained: absolute horror followed by total rejection. She literally covered her ears at one point, shouting that I was being influenced by apostates, that Satan had managed to blind me, that I needed to seek help from the elders immediately before it was too late. When I tried to show her the documents, she refused to look, saying she knew they were lies without even needing to read. The conditioning was so deep that no amount of evidence could penetrate the mental barrier the organization had built. At that moment, I understood that my 37-year marriage was effectively over, not because the love had ended, but because the organization would not allow her to remain married to an apostate. In the following days, my wife went straight to the elders to report my apostate views, as she was instructed to do. 2 elders appeared at my house the next afternoon, men I had known for years, with whom I had served side by side. They walked in with that rehearsed expression of concern, asking if we could talk about some concerns that had reached their ears. I knew exactly what was happening. I recognized the script because I had been the main actor in this very scene dozens of times before, only on the other side of the table. The difference was that now, I was no longer afraid. When they started with the careful questions, trying to get me to confess apostasy without making it look like an interrogation, I decided to spare us all the theater. I told them clearly that I no longer believed the organization was God's exclusive channel on earth, that I had discovered substantial evidence of doctrinal manipulation and cover-up of abuse, that my conscience no longer allowed me to promote teachings I considered harmful. I saw their expressions change from feigned concern to genuine shock and then to something resembling panic. I was a respected elder, a pillar of the congregation, and I was falling apart in front of them in a way that threatened their own certainties. They tried to convince me I was wrong, quoting scriptures out of context and circular arguments that used to work on me. But now I saw through the smoke screen. When I asked them to specifically explain how to reconcile the historical evidence of 587 with the organization's insistence on 607, they had no answer beyond, trust the governing body. When I asked how to justify the multiple failed prophecies and doctrinal changes, they only repeated the mantra about light getting brighter, without being able to explain why God would give false light that needed to be corrected later. Eventually, frustrated and visibly disturbed, they informed me that a judicial committee would be formed to deal with my apostasy. The judicial committee took place 3 weeks later, in a room behind the Kingdom Hall where I had spent countless hours in service to the organization. 3 elders I had mentored at some point in their lives were now sitting in judgment over me. The questions were predictable. Did I still believe the governing body was the faithful and discreet slave? Did I still believe this was the only organization of God on earth? Was I willing to stop expressing doubts and submit to theocratic guidance? To each question, I answered honestly, no, calmly explaining my reasons, knowing that every word sealed my fate but unable to lie one more time. The disfellowshipping was announced at the next meeting, a simple, devastating announcement: Thomas is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. No explanation, no context, just those words that instantly transformed a respected member into a non-person. 42 years of dedicated service erased in one sentence. Friends of decades immediately began to avoid me, looking away when they saw me on the street, changing sidewalks so as not to have to greet me. Relatives I deeply loved began to treat me as if I were dead. My wife moved into her sister's house, starting the separation proceedings. The loneliness was overwhelming. At 63, I discovered that I had built my entire life around the organization and now had nothing left. No social support system outside the congregation, few hobbies or interests beyond theocratic activities, no real friendships that could survive disfellowshipping. I spent weeks in deep depression, questioning if I had made a terrible mistake, if I should just swallow my doubts and crawl back to get the life I knew. The temptation was strong because the emptiness was unbearable. But then I started finding online communities of former Jehovah's Witnesses, people who had been through exactly what I was going through. Their stories were painfully familiar, their deconstruction processes mirrored mine. For the first time, I didn't feel alone or crazy. There were thousands, maybe millions of people who had woken up from the same illusion, who had faced the same devastating losses, and who were rebuilding their lives on the other side. Reading their stories gave me the courage to continue, not to give up when the pain seemed unbearable. Slowly, I began to build a new life. I reconnected with my nephew who had been disfellowshipped years ago, crying when I finally apologized for decades of cruel silence. He forgave me with a grace I didn't deserve. I started exploring interests I had always suppressed because they weren't theocratic enough: photography, classical literature, ancient history. I enrolled in a few community classes, forcing myself to interact with worldly people whom the organization had taught me to avoid, only to discover they were infinitely more genuine and kind than many within the congregation had been. The healing process was slow and uneven, with moments of liberating clarity alternating with periods of deep mourning for what I had lost. I mourned the wasted years promoting false doctrines, the relationships destroyed by the shunning policy, the missed opportunities because I followed organizational advice instead of my own judgment. But I also started to feel something I hadn't experienced in decades: genuine freedom. Freedom to think critically without fear, to ask questions without being labeled an apostate, to form my own opinions on morality and spirituality without an organizational manual dictating every detail. Today, 2 years after leaving the organization, I look back with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for the lost decades, for the relationships that will never be restored, for my brother who died without me having the chance to reconcile, for the life I could have lived if I hadn't been trapped in that mental prison for so long. But also gratitude for finally waking up, even if late, for having the courage to face uncomfortable truths and leave behind everything I knew in pursuit of authenticity. Many never wake up, live their entire lives within the bubble, die still believing the lies. At least I escaped while I still had time to experience some true freedom. My life now is simpler but infinitely richer. I have fewer friends, but the friendships I have built are based on genuine acceptance, not doctrinal conformity. I no longer have the absolute certainties the organization provided about every moral and spiritual issue, but I have learned that honest uncertainty is preferable to false certainty. I still have difficult days, moments when loneliness suffocates me, nights when I wake up sweating from nightmares about Armageddon, but those moments are becoming less frequent as I distance myself from the conditioning I suffered for 42 years. Healing is possible, even when it seems impossible at first. If you are reading this story and recognize in yourself the doubts I had, the same questions that kept me awake at night, I want you to know that you are not alone and you are not going crazy. Your doubts are valid, your questions deserve honest answers, and your conscience is trying to tell you something important. Investigating those doubts is not a lack of faith or spiritual weakness, it is courage and intellectual integrity. Yes, the path out is terrifying and devastating, you will lose things and people you love deeply, but on the other side there is something the organization can never offer: true freedom to be authentically yourself. And that freedom, however scary it is initially, is worth every tear shed in the process of conquering it. You deserve to live a life based on real truth, not on manufactured truth by fallible men who claim to speak for God while covering up their own mistakes and protecting their own authority above the well-being of the people under their control.